as good as it used to be. But for somebody to come forward with a plan that lines out steps to recoveries is very helpful to us. I mean, it gives us, you know, a fresh opinion, if you will. There might not be everything we can, you know, mother up to, but I guarantee you there'll be very productive things that will come out of that, and I applaud your organization for taking the time to do that, because I can't say enough about it, so thank you.
Thank you. We also really appreciate that, having the opportunity to work with the fish agencies, because without them, who knows what would be approved or what couldn't be approved. So that's really important, and we'd be happy. It should be done in the next few months, so we'd be happy to brief you when that's finished.
I'll look forward to seeing the final version. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Grader, AKA Zeke. How are you today?
Good, thank you, Chairman Hoffman and members. For the record, my name is Zeke Grader, and I'm the Executive Director for the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations, and we are also one of the fishing groups that's a member of the Golden Gate Salmon Association. I'm not a scientist, so maybe I'm a little bit out of place today, with all these the scientists in the room. But I do want to remark a little bit about flows and the relationship to salmon that we've seen as lay people with no particular interest other than what's necessary for abundant salmon runs. And as we've looked over the history of our salmon production in this state, particularly over the past 50 years or so, the one thing that stands out to us when we could look at years of high production, and by that I mean both good catches and good escapement, that is the number of fish back to the streams that we need for propagating the species, and years of low catch and low escapement. And generally what we found is that in years of high water conditions, high flows, good rainfall events, and generally that means that there's lower levels of pumping along with that, is that we tend to get good production. And this morning you saw the slide that was presented on the salmon production, and particularly one of the years that really was a spike was 1988. There you saw probably record salmon production, probably going back to almost the turn of the 19th and 20th century. Some 1.5, 1.6 million salmon were produced, 14 million pounds alone in the California salmon and commercial fishery, which probably put us #1 that year on Chinook salmon production along the whole Pacific coast, even Alaska. And what was significant about that is that those fish came off of a very good rain years, the El Nino years of the mid-'80s. We had good rainfall, and particularly a very good rain event in the spring of 1986, and we saw good production, in fact, the year before. And we also saw that trail way off. If you looked at 1991, 92, to where it was very low production. An interesting thing there was that followed the drought. And not only did we have a long drought, but there was increased pumping to try and make up for the shortages to the water system. So if you look throughout the charts, I think that's what you see. And what we saw here this morning, I think, was a lot of clutter, but really not a lot of clarity. And I think the thing that we look for is trying to get some clarity in all of this. And that's the one thing that stands out. Now, that's not to say, and we don't want to have anybody think, that we're saying that flow is the only thing. We saw what happened in 1982 and 83 when we had the severe El Nino and what that did to our salmon production. We've also seen what happened in the mid part of this decade when we had 2 years of no krill production. It wasn't that the ocean was dead, it's just that we didn't have these tiny euphausids that are so critical for small salmon coming out of the into the ocean for something for them to feed on. It's hard for them to try and eat a herring or anchovy that's 2 to 3 times larger than them. So we saw those impacts. But the interesting thing is that this was uniform up and down the coast, but there was no place hit as hard as the Central Valley system. And that was pretty obvious that we not only had this perfect storm of a bad ocean conditions for the young fish, but also bad conditions in river. So I think that's the clarity I think that helps in looking at this overall system. Now, as far as looking at the other impacts, I want to say that we are very definitely looking at other impacts. Predation, for example. My organization was the lead on a lawsuit that's caused a permanent lifting now of the gates at Red Bluff. That eliminates a huge predation area on the Sacramento River where pike minnows were devastating downstream juvenile salmon coming down. That's one. We'll continue to look at others. And I think, by the way, if people are worried about predation, maybe it's time that we introduce the commercial striped bass fishery, which did exist in this state for about 50 years between the 1870s and 1933. So if you want to do something rather than just eradicating stripers, maybe we should reintroduce a commercial fishery on those. Not eradicate them, but
Would we
bring
do it like they
fishery
do
down.
in the Columbia, where we'd have to pay them to catch the fish and then they could sell them?
I don't think you have to do that. The Columbia is not the best example of systems. We're working right now trying to get with Governor Kitzhaber up there, trying to get a stakeholder process going, but they're in a little bit different position where we are. Our primary battles are on water. Theirs is on hydropower, where they actually have the one place in the nation where there's a surplus of hydropower because of all the wind generation. The BPA doesn't like to talk about that. But the going on, I think, we're also concerned about water quality. We've just recently, we had a fairly favorable decision on our lawsuit on selenium discharges. And we're continuing to work on the other issues, whether they be hatchery reform, trying to get better ideas of what's going on in the ocean with instrumentation, so we have a better understanding of what's happening in the ocean environment as well. But I want to say, and I really appreciate the fact that this board is taking it on, because we watched as both CalFed and the Delta Vision process basically just ran for the weeds, so to speak, when it came to addressing flow, that this board is looking at that, because it is going to be critical if we're going to restore these fish. Yes, other things need to be done, but flow is going to be critical. So I just, like I say, our appreciation for what you're doing, and again, to try and not get lost in the, keep an idea of not get lost in the forest, and keep an idea on what's going on overall. And it's fairly clear if you look at the records that flow is a critical component for bringing these fish back, and I hope that's kept in mind throughout this process. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Zeke. Nice seeing you. Patrick Porgans?
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, my name is Patrick Porgans. I'm a solutionist with Planetary Solutionaries. And I know that some people don't like solutions, but I'm just geared that way. Now, we're talking about a couple of issues here today, and it's really nice that the board's having another workshop and comprehensive and all that. However, I have to reiterate on a couple of basic facts, because sometimes we do lose sight of the forest and the trees. First of all, we spent billions of dollars on trying to protect fish in the Delta. I don't know of anyone, but maybe somebody here does. The only report I did see on predation and impacts associated with pumping indicated at the time, it was Kimmerer. Thank you so much for helping me there. I appreciate it. And at the time, his report, Lynn's report, it's the environmental context of predation loss in the South Delta. This report wasn't done too long ago. Summary and conclusions. Fundamental problem, a lot of moving parts. Wow, we got that right. Predation is only one of those. No clear evidence yet of predatory impacts or export impacts. Wow, that's pretty funny. I mean, after 50 years, this board's had 50 years. I've only been coming here 40. So, forgive me. I missed that other 10 years. And I'm saying to you that the issue with respect to flow and predation, we got two kinds of predators. We got attorney predators, and then we got steelhead predators. And what we have here now is more of what you call, convolution. Attorneys are good at that. I'm saying to you, I understand you're under a mandate to come up with a flow criteria to protect these fish. I made that comment back during the D1630 hearings, and I said specifically numeric flow requirements for fishies. Now, I don't have an agenda, Mr. Chairman. I don't even eat fish. I don't even fish at all. I'm only interested in fish for one reason. It's a public trust resource. You have a responsibility to protect it, and I say this clearly from the record. This isn't an opinion. You haven't done the job. So we're back to where we're going to look to get ourselves in a position to minimize the amount of flow that we're going to be requiring to meet the fish doubling population, which, according to the information, is worse now than ever. Okay? You've seen the chart. I don't have to show it. Okay? We did find out today, and it's going to be good news for the water contractors, that the predation is really a problem. We have not yet quantified the impacts associated with the operation of the pumps in relationship to the demise of salmonids. We don't have it. So I'm saying to you, this being AKA Zeke Grader, I came to him with a comprehensive plan for salmon restoration in the entire state of California. I came to this board and I provided you with a comprehensive drainage resolution to the problems that are impacting the San Joaquin and also the Bay Delta. I was involved in the 11 years of hearings. I was there. I did everything I possibly can to bring it to your attention. You've delayed, and delayed. We are now at the point that I said we were going to be 11, 12, 13 years ago. I don't particularly like coming here, just so you know that. I really don't. It makes me sick. I mean, I just get sick being in this building. I'm letting you know, Mr. Chairman, and I say this in all sincerity because I know that in your heart you probably have the resources in mind there. You were a fisherman. You fished Butte Creek. You know the area. And I'm saying to you that this is more stall tactics. Get a numerical flow in here, apply that flow, and then, oh yeah, that's another part, excuse me. Every time that the Bureau and the Department of Water Resources violated the terms and conditions of their permits, and I'm talking hundreds of times, this board, even at the request of the Senate Pro Tem, and a dozen other legislators, enforced the law. Your predecessors decided that taking no action was an action. $29 million worth of water was taken, 500,000 acre feet of water that was either impounded or illegally stored. Exhibit number 9 and 10 from that board hearing back there in 1993. I got all the information. I'm sorry that if I come here and if I seem offensive. I've spent 40 years on this one. And you have everybody in this room here to thank for this condition. But I have to give the main credit to this board. And as far as knowing how many fish are being taken, you better go down there and find out who's counting those fish. It's the maintenance people. And now who's operating the pumps down there? Well, it seems like it's the San Luis Water Authority is involved now. Huh? So what does that bring us to? No one really knows what the heck's going on. You spent an awful lot of money and we're going in debt more than we need to. We don't need all the water they're sending south, and anybody that tries to tell me 25 million Southern Californians depend on that Delta water for their supply, I'm going to give them a little lesson in numbers. It's not true. You have so many half-truths, and then you depend on the department and the Bureau and McLaughlin. Give me a break. I mean, you got second-generation attorneys coming in here now, and third generations on this same project. I'm going to ask you, Mr. Chairman.
Are you the reason he left Chico to come to Sacramento, Patrick?
Well, I'd have to say this. I'd be flattering myself to think that. I mean, the man is, he's got a good mind. It's just that he seems to be working in a way where
He's trying to circumvent the issue. For his clients. Anyway, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, hope that sums it up.
I thought you had one more chart there, Patrick. There was a color graphic
Oh,
I
yeah,
saw.
oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for paying attention. Two things here, and this is anecdotal, okay? Anecdotal, so everybody knows. I put these charts together, you can't see them from there.
No, we can see them.
It's on my website.
We don't know what they mean, but,
I'm going to show you.
all right.
This is exports, okay? This man, Zeke Gray, was talking about exports. I went back in. This is Delta exports, okay? Going back to '86, right up until, say, what was it, 2006. So I looked at not only what the exports were, but I looked at the precip and the basin at the time. I got it. Oh, thank you. The runoff. I was looking at runoff in relationship to pumping, and then I was looking at fish populations. Okay? Now, anecdotally speaking, as Mr. Grader said, as '86 was a very wet year. So in '88, he said populations were back up again, going back when? They were. They had 1.3 million salmonids at Central Valley stock. So, and then we had another wet year back in '93, 94. In '96, we had a high number of fish. And the same thing in 2002. High flows, even exports were high. They were high. Like the fish were there. They came back. I was the guy that put in the satellite system over in the Russian River, started that, so we can do radio telemetry, so we can see what was going on in the up the watershed, and then we wanted to tie that to the buoys out there in NOAA, so we could say it was coming in and out at the same time, and do it all comprehensive. I couldn't get a nickel from anybody. I spent all my own money doing it, and I'm telling you now, I'm embarrassed with some of the people here that they can go on with this. Gotta stop it. Gotta end somewhere. Anyway, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. You're very gracious in allowing me to speak.
Patrick, you're an important member of the public. You're always welcome to speak here.
And I do suggest that Deirdre's work, I don't know how to say her last name, but a very, very good piece of research he did for you. Anyway, hope he works out for you.
Have a safe trip home.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Schutz.
Hi, I'm Chris Schutz, FERC Projects Director with the California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance. I also do some water rights work for them. I'm going to keep it very brief. We just wanted to let you know that we're going to submit documents from Dr. Ostrach, Dr. Moyle, and Dr. Bennett that has a different vision of the function of predation by stripers on salmonids than was presented to you by the San Joaquin Tributary Authority today. Also the testimony in the striper trial of Matt Nobriga, who, as I can paraphrase it, stated that in his opinion, reducing the number of stripers in the system would not necessarily and would likely not reduce the number of successful salmon outmigrants. I'd also like to point out that on the chart that the San Joaquin Tributary Authority put up, they didn't include us on the chart. When they put us on, we'd like to make it clear that in the predation box it should say disagree. Finally, there's a lot of things we've heard that we would take issue with, and we're not going to go into them and rebut them and talk about all that. If there's an opportunity to submit comments at the end, we'll do that. One thing that did sort of stick out, though, today for me was the idea that the Tributary Authority was, or association, I can't remember which it is, was willing to deal with salmonids and predation downstream to a certain point, but doesn't seem to be willing to contribute as far as San Joaquin flow goes in terms of delta hydrodynamics and its function for pelagic fisheries. I can understand why they don't want to do that. But I think that it's up to you all to make sure that that component is firmly included in your consideration of San Joaquin flow. That's been one of the issues that we've had with this, with Mr. Baggett's process, one of several issues, but the exclusion of consideration of that is something that I think you need to think about as well when you're considering how you're going to respond to that process. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Before you go, I know people are going to, can you just give me the headline on why you don't think stripers make a difference? Predation doesn't make a difference?
One of the main issues is that there's more predation by stripers on other predators than there is on salmonids. But I am not a striper expert personally, so I'm going to leave it to the folks who are fisheries experts to answer your question. Thanks.
Brock, the science panel, are you going to have expert panel, are you planning to have them come back
Yes,
up?
they
or-
said they had prepared some stuff in
Good,
answer to your
good.
question. So Sam, are you around? Okay. Well, those of them who yeah, are still here and are available, yeah.
You guys can have a way to.
And Sam, we don't have the name cards today. Can you just have them go down the row and introduce themselves?
Okay, I'll start with myself. I'm Sam Meritor with the Delta Stewardship Council, Delta Science Program, and we organize the science panel. Hand it off.
I'm Brad Cavallo with Kramer Fish Sciences.
John Lagier at UC Davis.
Randy Baxter, Fish and Game.
Kenny Rose from Louisiana State University.
Ted Summer, Department of Water Resources.
And
Gentlemen, I'll get,
Okay.
Mike, no, ladies first, go ahead.
Now, I just had to ask the question, after sitting through 2 days, are you going to change any of your Part 1, Part 2, Part 3 lists? And if so, what are you adding and what are you deleting? And
So we had a extensive discussion over our 30-minute lunch.
Wait a minute, I gave you 55 minutes today.
It took us that
The
long.
20
to get
minutes was
organized.
yesterday.
And so we could, however you want to proceed, we could answer questions, or we remembered 4 or 5 that were posed that we could go down the list, what our responses are to those, or whichever you prefer. One of which was the, would we revise our report, having listened to this for 2 days. So we could start there and tell you what questions we thought we heard. And I've been designated the, I don't know what they call me, the spokesperson, I guess. Despite, I stepped out of the room at the wrong time and I was designated the spokesperson, so. So what we propose to do is we can start with that question. And I will say a few things and then the panel members will just chime in and interrupt me if necessary, which sometimes is the case. Yes, there are some things. I don't think, the consensus was we wouldn't take anything out of the report, but there are things we might emphasize differently. And it's clear that predation is a much more prevalent and prominent issue than we had given attention to. So one of the additions would be how could we in a scientific way address the predation? So that I would put that in the missing category to some extent. And then we would also emphasize several other things, such as the real need for field experiments, which is in there, but it can also, it may not have been in bold italics and underlined perhaps the way it should have been. And a third topic, and then hopefully somebody will interrupt me on my left or right, is the idea of correlations and trying to solve this problem, which is a thorny problem based on a lot of correlations. And we noticed that the first workshop talked quite a bit about that, and we probably should have emphasized it more as well. you can make your head spin the number of correlations we experienced here. Surprisingly, sometimes even using the same data.
A lot of dots and bubbles, huh?
I'll just expand on that one and then let the panel chime in, because that led to some other comments we had. Perhaps it's better if we come back to that. So we'll come back to that question about the correlations, but those are some of the things that we heard at lunch that we were either missing or not emphasized appropriately. And then if people want to add anything to that, they should.
So I might go a bit beyond lunch. I made a few notes this afternoon. I think the primary, what we heard was a more detailed amplification of the points in our report. I wouldn't take anything out, and I wouldn't add anything, but it does some things are amplified. So let me run through a few quickly. Where we write about nutrients, I think a better title would be bottom-up effects in the food web. And in the text there, we talk about phytoplankton and relation to fish and so on, but it's more than just nutrients. And so you heard a lot of details about that. And even the ocean influence, we heard about ocean influence, but it's all about salmon survival in the ocean, not about the trophic or the sort of feeding of the bay from the ocean side. I think that's still an unknown. Secondly, we heard a lot about smaller scales versus summary indices, and I think they came in really strongly under flow. Aggregate, mean annual flow is maybe not a very good predictor, and there are many things you can do, and we need those, and that really gets right back to the correlation issue. What is a good correlation and what is not? And there are a number of points presented, but there are also a number of points which weren't talked about in some of the correlations, and so I think if you like, sort of on both sides of the issue, there were some correlations that I had to look at really hard and definitely do some homework onto before I'm going to believe them. Let's put it that way. But there are a lot of different correlations between flow and fish. And another part of that is we have to be clear on mechanism. Just the fact that you have an association doesn't mean that it's related or causative or anything. If you've got a mechanism, you can start believing in it more. So I'm going to go on for a little while, colleagues. The third is turbidity. It plays into that bottom-up food web. But for me, and maybe not for my colleagues, but for me, I hadn't fully appreciated how a number of people talked about the importance of turbidity. But that takes you right through to the next point, which is we have to be explicit about environmental influences on data. So we had, actually today, I guess, this morning, the fall midwater trawl data, for example. If the water's getting deeper, if the water's getting more turbid, is it influencing our data and not just a relationship? So these are all in the sense of uncertainties. Kenny just mentioned predation. We mention it. We probably could have emphasized it some more. And then let's see here. Entrainment, it was only emphasized as an uncertainty to me, because I heard some people say it doesn't matter and others say it is all important. And I think for the same, if I could try to keep with everything, for the same organisms and the same problems. Then last, I'm not sure. Oh, it's specific measurable outcomes. We talk about that, and then that is again underlined by a lot of people. Don't be vague in general. If there's some management action you're going to do and you're expecting a benefit, be specific about what it is and what action you're doing to get there. So those are just some of the notes that I made.
I can jump in with some more, Kenny, if you like.
He had a longer lunch than I did, I think. So.
The one I would add, to me, this is all about data. Data should be the primary source that influences us. And one thing that I guess I wish we would have emphasized more or talked about is telemetry data from the fish tagging studies that are going on, particularly with juvenile salmonids in the Delta. I think they're telling us a heck of a lot. We didn't even scratch the surface of it. But they're telling us a lot about interpreting what we've seen from past studies that were based on coded wire tags or other sampling programs. And there's a lot of insights there, much more than I could express in a couple of minutes babbling here before you. But there's reports that are out that you should look carefully at the data in. There's new reports that will be forthcoming very soon, I think, that really help explain a lot about what goes on with salmon in the Delta, what affects them and what doesn't.
You know, Brock, I'm not certain on this panel how long we have them at our disposal. And does it go through these series of hearings, or are they decommissioned, or how does that work?
Sam, how are you guys handling that?
Well, we organized these panels specifically for this workshop. That said, if there are specific questions that you have for them, we can certainly facilitate that. You're going to get a different panel at the next workshop.
Let me
though.
let me pose my question, and I'll let you, as scientists, kind of either roll your eyes or address
Excuse
it.
me, Charlie, that's a really important point Sam made. There's a different panel for every workshop.
Okay.
Okay.
So maybe this is more appropriate for a different panel. I'll leave that to you. And I'll have to confess, when I was in college and I'd go in the college union, there was always somebody deeply involved in a philosophical discussion, and I was usually in there looking at girls. But I have somewhat of a philosophical question for you. We talk almost in passing about invasive species, and we kind of talk about them like they're going to come and go, and some of them do. I think of the mitten crab that we had here some years ago. My God, they were clear up in Sutter County burrowing in rice checks before I was on the water board, and we had no idea what we were going to do with them, and then they just sort of disappeared or went someplace else. But so many of these things, even though we assume they're temporary, either for a lack of will, a lack of resources, or a lack of methodology, they become a permanent part of the ecosystem. And you can use the striped bass in the Delta, the largemouth bass, as an example. I mean, they were probably introduced, but they were non-native species. So if you want to make a connection between non-native species and invasives, in many respects, to me, they're about the same. Now, all of a sudden, they're part of the ecosystem. They have an economic value. Certainly, there are people that fish to a great degree for all of them, but they have an effect on the ecosystem. And so we're sitting here trying to figure out, based on primarily on pelagic organisms and salmonids, how to make this system healthier. I think everybody recognizes that we've got a lot to do. But in that equation, we've got invasive species that we just we talk about. We talk about the corbicula and the invasive jellyfish and what goes in them and what comes out of them. But at what point do we, as a regulatory agency, look at these invasives and say they have evolved into a permanent part of this ecosystem? And at what point do we quit taking water that's being put to another beneficial use someplace else and throw them at a system to deal? Not entirely. I mean, predation isn't the whole thing. Flows aren't the whole thing, regardless of what some people will say. The food web isn't the whole thing. Invasives aren't the whole thing, but they're a component. And I think one thing I've heard today over and over, with the exception of a few people's opinion, there's no one driver that's going to be corrected and fix this whole system. And so how do we philosophically deal with invasives? I mean, do we just say, yeah, they're there, and we're going to take water from this beneficial use and put it over here to help plug this hole because we don't know what to do with them? Or do we say this system is evolving and there isn't anything we can do about certain portions of it? I hope that makes sense. It makes sense to me, but that doesn't always make sense when it comes out of my mouth. But I didn't look at you specifically this time.
well,
You're volunteering. That's a good thing.
I'll start, but there are panel members who are much more familiar with the local situation than I probably am. But I think that it kind of goes back to one of our earlier comments about prevention is the best way, and there are ways to reduce the risk of an invasive species, be it ballast water controls, various things that can be done that are done in other places. It never makes the risk zero, but it can be reduced.
And we have policies dealing with ballast waters.
And then once you acknowledge they're going to happen anyway, maybe at a lower probability, I think it becomes an optimization question at some point. And it's difficult to balance those trade-offs. But ultimately, that's what it becomes, because sometimes you just cannot manipulate them sufficiently, and other times you can. And it's a matter of cost, whether your units of cost are dollar or water or whatever they are. So, I mean, that's somewhat of a, it's an evasive answer, but my bottom line is I think they're a fact of life out here. And so there needs to be an adaptive way and a flexible way to deal with these kind of perturbations to the system, whether you create buffers, whether some people call it precautionary principle, and that's how I would kind of view them, because they're very difficult to manipulate in many cases.
But do you get to a point where the results of their existence get to be so intrusive on the species that are important to all of us that you're unable to control them anymore? I mean, it's a man-made evolutionary thing, if you will, and it takes an awful lot of resources without many quantifiable results, quite honestly.
So part of that is sometimes we refer to it as shifting baselines, that sometimes the baseline system shifts. For example, an invasive species disrupts the food web. And I don't see how you can hope to, in some cases, manipulate the system with the knobs you have available to always dampen it to the point. And so it's a new baseline, and that's bothersome.
I mean, I'm not saying it lightheartedly at all. It is very bothersome to me.
No, I understand, and now I'm going to be quiet. We're hoping.
I would just say that and this is my individual thoughts as opposed to agency.
That's the advantage of not having
something-
you guys get to collaborate on a question.
I think that most of the important invasives that are in the system are in the system to say, and that we're probably, just like any of the other organisms in there, circumstances, either man-made or natural, are going to shift against them or for them. Using the example of Pitama corbula, the latest information suggests that there's recruitment that goes on in the fall that might be disrupted by fall flows. So I'm not suggesting that that's something that we want to do, but I'm just suggesting that the more we know, the more we'll be able to predict in terms of the environmental circumstances that we have both available to us and that occur, what might happen to individual organisms to benefit others or something along those lines. Beyond that, there are probably huge environmental changes that are going to happen over time that are going to shift the baseline. As salt intrudes further in, we're going to march a lot of the freshwater predators further and further back into potentially smaller habitat, and there may be some conflicts of fish being shoved into smaller habitats, which I think we talked about a little bit during the original presentation, and I don't know that there's a lot we can do about that either.
So much of what we're doing is mitigation for the dams that we have in the state of California. And, that's a clear responsibility of ours. So you do your best to mitigate for the effects of a structure that's upstream, and then all of a sudden you've got these freeloaders in the system that are changing the dynamics of it. So it's
Yeah, I think you could add channels to that, dams and channels, canals.
I did. The other thing I want to mention is we don't always maybe look at some of these invasive species the same way as managers. As scientists, we look at them often as surrogates or indicators of the ecosystem. And the best example of that is the pelagic organism decline. Randy and I were part of a team that were kind of with our fingers to the pulse of the ecosystem around 2000. And what really got our attention was the decline in not only the two major native pelagic fishes of the delta, but also the two major alien fishes, striped bass and threadfin shad. And when they're all declining simultaneously, it's telling us there's something much bigger going on than just an immediate invasive in species effect from that community.
So I will add, you can do some things to help your planning. There are analyses that can be done that would look at what types of invaders, what are their traits that the system is vulnerable to in particular, and what would be, if they do come, what would be the consequences. That can be done with some modeling that's somewhat theoretical and exploratory, but you can prepare a little bit. What's the system vulnerable to? Because there is theories about the traits of these invaders. Are they high reproductive, disperse quickly? Are they slow? Do they exploit certain habitats? So there is some analyses that could be done, but it's mostly in preparation rather than to deal with that.
Can I
We've
just-
got enough of them that we're past the hypothetical threat at this point. so-
Yeah, let me just flag something though, and this is, maybe you want to set a specific panel to talk about. I mean, part of the philosophy that's being discussed in other places, including here, is the whole notion of giving the natives more of a fighting chance. That's why people are talking about restoring habitat, changing flows, temperature, is that right now the non-natives are flourishing in the system. And so the question is, how do you give them a fighting chance in even just a few places? I don't think we're at the point of giving up on them yet.
Well, I'm not suggesting.
I know, I'm only saying it because it sounds like you're advancing to it. So that's the only reason I'm saying anything, which is a very complicated situation with a lot of things going on to try and even the odds.
That's right. That's restoring function and those mechanisms that you're talking about that underlie the correlations. I'd like to ask the panel or just point something out and see if you'd like to update it compared to what you said in your original presentation, which was my favorite. Well, I had a lot of favorites, but let's do a couple of them. You had a slide that said management hindrances. Remember that, everyone? There were 4. Number 1 was lack of variable flow. Or I'm sorry, yeah, the lack of a variable flow in the system was a hindrance to management of these resources. A homogeneous delta was number 2. Number 3 was hatchery practices. And number 4 was harvest in the ocean. This was your slide. I looked at those 4 and I thought, well, what can the State Water Board do? You know, we're looking at that first one, obviously, lack of variable flow, and how to set up. And we have a variable flow regime in the existing Bay Delta plan. It's imperfect. There's a system there. Apparently, it isn't necessarily doing the trick. And you mentioned time scale a lot, which I respect very much. But then I also respect the time scale of the operators, whether they're DWR, BURAC, or other tributary managers. And we had a good example of that from Contra Costa Water District today about that real-time management of the system. So there's time scale of scientific effects, there's time scale of management that's feasible by humans and institutions. So that's a fun sort of sidebar I'd like you to talk more about. Where's our optimization in terms of the time scales that are appropriate for management and limitations for regulatory reasons. And so that was the flow one. Now we had 3 other ones. We had a homogeneous delta. It relates very much to the floodplain habitat issue, what Felicia just brought up about restoring function, whether in the delta or in the tributaries. What can the State Water Board do there? Well, through my extensive experience in the regulatory process, I can say there's places where we can kind of facilitate those type of projects through permitting. I mean, we're bought in, regional and state boards, about the importance of functions and water quality and fishery resources that we're discussing. But then that gets into an interesting gray area excuse me, on the Bay Delta plan. I think it's more in the implementation section. That is, how much detail should the state board get into in terms of projects that should be required to meet and protect beneficial uses. And I think there will be a lot of synergy in that type of program of implementation if we synergize with other plans. You know, I don't think the science panel delved into as much as you might like to, but in terms of all the other plans for the area, Delta Plan, BDCP, and then there's this fish restoration thing that DWR presented to us yesterday. So there's an opportunity, and I think going forward, we could be informed about how much detail is appropriate within the Bay Delta Plan in terms of addressing the homogeneous delta. And the other two, hatchery practices, harvest in the ocean, we've talked about that. I'm not sure how much or how far we go in the Bay Delta Plan. But is it fair to say that you were adding a fifth management hindrance, which is predator suppression? Is that the home for that?
No.
That's not a hindrance.
Well, that was a very long question. So.
Well, I'm a state board member. I get to.
Yeah. So if
I try to indicate I'm listening to folks as I ask a question.
Yeah, and you read the report too. No, I would put the predator, personally, the predator control as one of the possible actions to encourage or demand. But I'm not yet convinced it rises to the level of those four general categories. That's just my view of it. And remember, we have a multi-species problem. So we have to also think about some of the other species that are of interest, and so that would be my response to that.
And also, I had that time scale question. You all have talked about time scale management. You know, there's daily, sub-daily issues, but then there's operational on the weekly or monthly.
Before we go to that, though, I think it would be worth noting that section 3.5 that you're referring to, that was specifically on the topic of managing for sunlighted life history diversity. It wasn't management and hindrances for everything. And so those four things were specific to what are limiting life history diversity of salmonids. So it's, Kenny's right, predation doesn't fit into that topic.
At the same level, maybe. So I think one of the circumstances that's coming up that might be beneficial, and I think it was brought up earlier, is that Fish and Game will be convening a panel to investigate, you know, the issue of predation and how we might experiment to see what the impacts actually are and whether we have the ability to do anything about that. Right now, I don't feel like, even though I've been around the predation issue for quite a long time, I don't feel like I have enough information or background to make any solid statements about how great I think it is. But together we chose not to make a bigger issue of it in our report.
I have three quick things, I think. Someone mentioned, Contra Costa talked about the flow index. Have you all looked at the flow index, or has your science group looked at the flow index?
We have not.
Have you? Well, anyway, is someone going to look at the flow index?
I think
So maybe we can offer a comment, and that may either stimulate more comments or answer some that you have. And one of the topics we discussed at lunch, and there was a lot of agreement on it, was it's quite a difficult challenge you have in front of you, and of course you don't need us to tell you that. But how do you filter through this contradictory information that's being presented? And maybe that's where we can help a bit in terms of process. I mean, we can't tell you which correlation was better than the other without looking at it closely. But we are somewhat familiar with the process of how you might filter through the scientific messages you've been hearing. And sometimes even the same data seem to give contradictory interpretations. And, you know, our impression was that some of the stuff was gems, some of it was solid, some of it was chatter, and some of it was really misguided. So how do you filter through that? And we would suggest to you, if we could be presumptuous enough to make a suggestion like this, that we don't think this can be, that the best way to approach this is with review and summary. And we don't pretend to know your staffing or anything. But this is quite a formidable science challenge to figure out what are the gems and what are the solid stuff. So it almost seems like there's 5 or 6 major issues that we discussed that require actually getting into the raw data and seeing why people are analyzing it the way they are and what's a good way to do it and some of the modeling. And that's an amazing expertise to try to have a staff. And we don't know your staff, but that's a challenge for anything. So we would just emphasize to you that some of these issues, and not all, but some, look to be like someone's really can't just summarize what was presented. You need to go in and address it as a scientific question. What is the hypothesis? What is a good way to analyze it? And what do you come out with? And I don't know how you do that. I know there's a lot of workshops out here, and that may be a way to get the interested parties involved. And there's always issues of trust and those things that go on with that. But if you put, I think, the right people in the right room, and someone else suggested that, we think as a panel that you can resolve some of these uncertainties that are due to different people doing the analyses. And we just wanted to make that comment that it struck us. We were getting a little dizzy with the same data being shown 18 different ways and 9 interpretations. So
I thought it was just me that was getting dizzy.
no. So we just offer that as a comment, and maybe that, I don't know if that takes care of any of your other questions, but if there's a way to get enough people together to address these issues and not just summarize or review what was done, because I don't know how you would distinguish the credibility or the scientific solidness of the different analyses. They all looked kind of reasonable at some level. So we offer that as a recommendation that was not in our report, for example.
And I'd like to comment on the flow index question, if I could, just really briefly. That I believe it was a great presentation by Deanna. I believe the purpose of that was to propose an alternative to OMR that was more calculatable, and so that's one issue. The other issue is, what does that index mean for fish? And that's an entirely separate question, and that wasn't the subject of Deanna's presentation. And what it means for fish depends on what fish you're talking about or what species you're talking about. And that was something we touched on in our submittal. And there's a lot of evidence that it's different for salmonids than for other fish. So I guess it's just an example of where you have to have some expertise in looking at the data to catch those kind of subtleties.
We had used the term in SWAT expert teams that come in with, as opposed to us, which was a very broad questions were asked of us, come in with very specific things and roll up your sleeves and get dirty. For some of these issues,